Many of you know that I'm from Pittsburgh, and I'm from a neighborhood there called Brookline. And I was from the oldest parish in Brookline, called Resurrection. And as the population grew, the bishop erected 2 other parishes in the same neighborhood. And one of them was St. Pius X. And it was a new structure, and as was often the case in the early 60s, they built first what would eventually, they hoped, become the social hall, and eventually would build a church. But it was a little bit of a smaller building, pretty simple. But at the beginning of 2nd grade, as we were preparing for First Communion, my teacher, Sister Jane Ann, said, "Who can tell me something about St. Pius X?" So I raised my hand and I said, "He liked air conditioning." And she looked and I said, "St. Pius X is the only air-conditioned church in our area." That wasn't the answer she was looking for. Rather, she was hoping that I would speak about how St. Pius X had such great devotion for the Eucharist that it was St. Pius X, as Pope, who lowered the age once again for young people to receive Holy Communion. So it took us down to the age of discretion. But St. Pius X had such great devotion for the Eucharist, and his great desire was to feed the flock that God had entrusted to him. We heard the very powerful and beautiful gospel today at the end of St. John's Gospel that talks about that exchange that Jesus has with Simon Peter. And I always like the passage first because we hear that Jesus had breakfast with the apostles. I suspect that there are some of you that love going out for breakfast. It's a way in which we're able to establish such wonderful friendships. That was always something that was great with the daily mass crowd in my parish, is that people would go out for breakfast. So I love that idea of Jesus being so close to the apostles that he ate breakfast with them. In fact, he fixed that breakfast. But then he enters into an exchange with Simon Peter. And you'll remember, this is after Jesus' death and resurrection. It's after the time that Simon Peter had betrayed the Lord 3 times, that he had denied him 3 times. And so there's this beautiful parallel between Peter denying him 3 times and then Jesus asking him 3 times, "Do you love me?" And each time Peter answers, he hems and he haws a little bit, trying to get to the right kind of love that Jesus was looking at. And eventually he says, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." And the Lord gives him that beautiful command to feed his sheep, to feed his flock, to tend his flock. It's the way in which we understand the role of Peter and his successors. This gospel was chosen. We're the only people probably listening to this gospel today, because in the rest of the church it's a different gospel. But for us, because we're celebrating the feast of St. Pius, and it's a gospel that's given to us in particular for saints who were popes. And it speaks of that mission that the Holy Father is given as the successor of Peter, to feed Jesus' sheep, to be a shepherd as Jesus was a shepherd. We heard in our first reading today, and Joe does such a great job always with reading, we heard the beautiful way about how it is that God wants his sheep to be tended. He wants them to enjoy the best pastures. That's what he desires for us. And we see that so beautifully in the life of Jesus, who tended all of us with his great love, eventually leading him to lay down his life for our sake. As Jesus handed over the church, we often hear about handing over the keys to St. Peter. But he does that in a way where he really then asks Peter to tend his flock in the same way that Jesus did as the Good Shepherd. And so we count on the Holy Father to be able to feed us. And St. Pius X understood that, certainly in his great devotion for the Eucharist. It's not surprising that here in your church, right, that you would have your main window would talk about the Eucharist. It's so appropriate for St. Pius X, who understood that that's the principal way in which a priest and which a pope is able to feed the flock, is by leading them to a great love for the Eucharist and appreciation of the Eucharist. But St. Pius X also understood what we heard in our second reading today as well. And that if you're going to be that loving shepherd in imitation of Jesus, you also have to be willing to lead people to the truth, to teach them, to feed them with the truth. And for St. Pius X, that was one of his great desires in life, was to help people to avoid those things that weren't true, those distractions, those things that would keep them away from Jesus, and instead to keep them focused always on the truth that is taught by the Catholic Church. So St. Pius X really did such a magnificent job of teaching us about what's expected of the Pope as a successor of Peter. That just as that was relevant for Peter himself, so too at the beginning of the 20th century, that was important for the successor of Peter. And dare I say, that's important for Pope Francis as well, right? So we have to always pray for the Pope that he might be able to feed us, as did St. Pius X, but most especially as did Jesus. It's fascinating that St. Pius X, you probably know the stories better than I, but he understood that in his role as Pope, he had to really be an exemplar of simplicity. And so people would complain to him. He had 3 sisters that lived close to Rome, and they lived almost in poverty. And they would say, "Holy Father, you're the Pope. Can't you help them?" They can help themselves, right? But he didn't want to use his position in any way that would be not correct, or that would suggest that somehow he was better than others. And so he avoided all of those privileges. But it was in his very humility that he was able to demonstrate how Jesus himself emptied himself of all of the trappings of divinity. He lived such a simple life, St. Pius X, and it's something that inspires us. Now, you're probably thinking that's all very beautiful about this great saint, but what does it have to do with us? Certainly, there's something very particular for all of us as Catholics to be able to respond to the teaching of St. Pius X. But I suspect something particular about you as a parish named in his honor. And that's to have that great devotion to the Eucharist, to have that great dedication to passing on the faith to our young people, as young as they come, of being able to teach the truth and to avoid anything that might lead people away from Jesus. Your parish has been so successful in doing that. I congratulate you for that. It's beautiful today as we have this opportunity for the celebration after Mass to see the way in which you as a parish have come together with Jesus as your focal point, with the Eucharist as the center of your lives, that you've been able to really demonstrate those priorities that make a Catholic family, that make a Catholic parish great. So I have the opportunity on behalf of the Archdiocese to congratulate you for that, but also to challenge you that you might continue to keep those things as priorities under Father TJ's guidance and leadership, and the great lay leaders that you have here, that you might always keep your eyes fixed on Jesus, that you might keep your heart fixed on the Eucharist, that you might be really steadfast in passing on the faith to our young people, and that you might always desire nothing but the truth. If we're able to follow in that path, we can trust that the Lord is going to bless this parish and this community and this archdiocese for many years to come.